This is something that we're seeing today's total overuse of a non-medically indicated overuse of antibiotics, particularly early on in life. So pediatricians, upon the urging of concerned mothers when their child has a bad cold, they want an antibiotic because they don't want to see their child suffering. But 90% of these colds or upper respiratory tract infections are caused by viruses, which will not respond to the antibiotics.
Welcome to Longevity by Design, a podcast designed to give individuals access to the leading scientific information in the field of longevity. The ability to add years to your life and life to your years needs no opinion. Join us as we ask science to take the wheel. In each episode, Dr. Gil Blander joins a co-host and an industry expert in the field of longevity, shining a light and getting the answers to the key question: how can we live a longer, healthier life?
Hello, I'm Dr. Gil Blander, and welcome to Longevity by Design, how to live a longer, healthier life. We are produced by Inside Tracker, your science-based guide to optimize your body from the inside out. Our guest today is Dr. Emeran Mayer, a pioneer in the science of gut-brain connection. Dr. Mayer is distinguished research professor in the Department of Medicine, Physiology, and Psychiatry at UCLA, where he also serves as executive director of the Center for Neurobiology and Stress Resilience, and co-director of the CURE, Digestive Disease Research Center. Born and raised in a small town in Germany, Dr. Mayer earned his MD and PhD degree in Munich before moving to the United States for his medical training at UCLA, where he has built a groundbreaking career spanning more than 4 decades. He is the author of best-selling books, The Mind-Gut Connection and The Gut-Immune Connection, and his research has been central to understanding of how our gut microbiome, diet, emotion, and brain interact to shape our health, behavior, and longevity. Welcome, Dr. Mayer.
Thanks, Gil, for the introduction, having me on your show, and for the kind introduction. Looking forward to this conversation.
You are welcome. And before we dive in, if you are enjoying Longevity by Design, please like and follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, and leave comments so you never miss an episode. So I would like to start, Dr. Mayer, with your background. And you literally built an extraordinary career exploring the connection between the brain, gut, and mind. What first drew you to this intersection of neuroscience, gastroenterology, and psychology?
Well, I would say this goes really way back, to my college times. I've always been really interested in the psychological literature. I've read all the big names from, Carl Jung to Freud to like all the psychologists. It's always fascinated me. And I came relatively late to an interest in medicine and in biology. So it came more from this side of psychology, even philosophy to a certain point. And make a long story short, when it was time to make a decision to go to university, I really struggled what field I should choose. And really in the last minute came to the idea of going to medical school. I would say based on my grades, and a lot of people telling me, with his grades, you should apply for medical school. And as soon as I was in, I was mostly interested in brain-body interactions, not brain-gut, but brain-body interactions. I looked so in Germany, in order to get your MD degree, you had 2 options. One is you do a PhD equivalent. It won't be accepted as a PhD in the US, but it's the same, like 4 years in a basic science lab. Or you can just do a literature review and get your MD as well. So I took the hard way, and it was kind of interesting in retrospect to find a supervisor for this project, because all the old professors that I talked to, they said, yeah, Dr. Mayer, we know, that the mind and the body are connected, but you can't really study it scientifically. I finally found somebody in the Cardiovascular Research Institute in Munich who was doing studies on the effect of stress on cardiac blood flow and microcirculation. This was kind of exactly what I was looking for, the sympathetic nervous system, how it influences, in response to external stimuli, the distribution of blood in different layers of the heart. But then I made a mistake probably to do a clinical rotation during that time at the Mass General Hospital in Boston in gastroenterology. And I realized that, as a clinical specialty, it was a lot more interesting. And I came back, and my, thesis supervisor was all upset that I would basically, leave my early career success behind. And but it was not that hard to transplant, what I'd learned there in terms of stress, sympathetic innervation, how the brain can influence the organs in this way. At that point, it was all top down, from the brain to the body. Then at the time, there was a disorder, irritable bowel syndrome, very common. And that seemed to be the easiest entryway into the clinical application of this research. And I spent, the next 25 years really focusing on that, studying with all the way from studying really basic science, cultured neurons, interactions with muscle cells. And but make a long story short, it got all the way to human studies. I figured this out early on. Without the human studies, this wouldn't be sufficient. And so we were the first group that used functional brain imaging to look at the connections between the gut and the brain. And a lot of my research then focused really on the bottom-up signaling. What signals does the gut generate that reach the brain, and what do they do in the brain? How do they modulate networks in the brain, and how does that affect symptoms? So I would say that's pretty, for a medical student, an unusual career trajectory to go from psychology and philosophy to to hardcore basic science. But I mean, that's how it went.
And can you explain to our audience what is irritable bowel syndrome?
It's a common disorder affecting anywhere between 4 and 10% of the population. People have chronic symptoms of abdominal pain and alteration of bowel movements, bowel habits. And this definition undergoes variations every 4 years, because there's an entity called the Rome Foundation that gets together people, and they basically change the definition, and then people are forced to do new studies to confirm that the new definition, how it differs from the old one. So kind of in my opinion, a ridiculous effort that has not brought us closer to understanding it. So we're talking about chronic visceral pain, chronically recurring visceral pain in the absence of any detectable organic changes in the gut, and that has to be associated with a change in the bowel habits in either direction.
And what is the treatment? What was the treatment then, and any progress with the treatment today?
So the treatment, really interesting, personal history to having gone through this. This was considered a gut disease, and the people involved in this were absolutely convinced it's an abnormality of gut contractions or motility, and they were defending this at all costs. This has nothing to do with the brain, and people characterized all these gut contractions, but in the long term, and you can show anything in mouse models really, but then very small percentages applicable to human disease. And so this was a big battle with funding institutions, publications, to accept this new model of basically saying this is a disorder of altered brain-gut interactions. It's not a gut disease. And interesting to me also, about 5 years ago, finally this committee, this Rome committee, came up with the idea, yes, we now call it a disorder of brain-gut interactions. It took 30 years um, which is really amazing.
And I assume that you influence the decision to make it as a disorder of a gut-brain interaction. So let's talk about that a bit. And can you explain how this communication work between the gut and the brain? They are pretty far away. And how do they communicate between each other?
So there's multiple ways. So let's talk about top-down. Obviously, the top-down and the bottom-up communication are integrated, but let's say with the top-down. So any emotion that we have that is generated in circuit networks within the brain always has a mirror image in the body, and particularly in the gut. For most people, that's non-perceptible. So because we would go crazy if every time, we are upset or happy, or that there would be a voice from the gut that would contribute to this experience. But so we know from studies, both from stress, so negative emotions, fear, anxiety, anger, have distinct patterns of activity and motility change, so contractions from the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the colon. Each of those areas shows its own pattern. And it's mediated primarily by what's called the autonomic nervous system. So these pathways, these nervous system pathways that connect brain circuits or brain stem circuits with the gut. And the gut also has its nervous system, and that nervous system gets these signals from our brain. And changes its behavior, and that then changes bowel habits, secretion, and in sensitive people, it also changes perception of what goes on. This brain signal down to the gut also changes the sensitivity. So a hallmark, for example, of IBS that we really pushed over several years, finally being fully accepted, is this visceral hypersensitivity. As I told you, we don't feel all the things that are happening in our gut, a very small portion. Even though our gut is the biggest sensory organ, it's like a basketball court if you stretch it out with millions, hundreds of millions of sensors built into it that record everything that goes on there, from contractions, temperature, food components. So the brain can control the sensitivity of this apparatus and keeps it normally at a level that we only feel something if it's dangerous. So for example, a gastroenteric infection or inflammation. So that we will feel, and because we can do something about it. But 95% of what goes on and what's sent to the brain is not pursued.
So how do you feel it? You feel a tummy ache? What do you feel when the sensor are activating it? What is the feeling that you feel?
Yeah, if it's in a pathological state, as a warning symptoms, it is pain. Pain or significant discomfort. The other sensations, like the subtle influences on mood and emotions, that's much more subtle, and that a lot of people don't realize has anything to do with their gut. So, we could go on for a long time on this. I spend most of my research time on this top-down, the first part of it. Now, the bottom-up one has to do with the sensitivities that, I sort of, and my research group realized early on that it's that there's something abnormal what people experience and the sensations that they experience, and that IBS patients are more sensitive to contractions. And then we developed this experimental paradigm of a distension of a small balloon and in different parts of the intestine or in the stomach, and looked at the sensitivity, the perception, and also then what happens within the brain when these distensions happen. And we found that the response of the brain was different to these in IBS patients, in general, all pointing in the direction of greater sensitivity, greater awareness, and greater attention that the brain pays to these sensations. So our attention normally is obviously focused on the outside world, because I mean that's essential for survival. We wouldn't want to be bothered by all these. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on when you eat a hamburger. You know, there's hundreds of processes going on in the gut with acid secretion and bile secretion, all sort of nasty things. But we don't want to know this. You know, our attention should be focused outside for survival. But in IBS patients, that takes on a very important role.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, and from what I understood from you, a lot of that is basically in your brain. So IBS patient, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of that coming from your brain, and you don't really have a problem with your gut, but your brain sends a signal that make the problem. That's fair to say?
Yeah, and that has been a long battle. I mean, first the battle was, you know, does the brain play any role in it? Then the second one is this, so once people accepted this hypersensitivity concept and everybody jumped on, well, it's the sensors, the nerve endings in the gut, you know, and a lot of studies were published on molecular, beautiful studies on the sensory innervation of the gut. And, but ultimately, in my opinion, the great majority of this sensitivity is regulated at the brainstem level, and these interactions between the brainstem and the spinal cord. So it's a neural phenomenon. We don't understand it 100% now, but I think we've gotten pretty close to that. And you know, I mean, we have interventions that people can do, like relaxation exercises, deep abdominal breathing, that can change this sensitivity quickly. So, I mean, it would be unlikely if this were a molecular abnormality on, for example, on the capsaicin receptor in the gut that senses, you know, certain molecules in the gut and causes pain. You wouldn't be able to quickly change it with deep diaphragmatic breathing or with shifting your attention, like mindfulness-based stress reduction. You know,
So can we quantify it in a way? And come and say, I know 80% of the IBS is because of emotion and stress and anxiety, and only 20% is pathology, or it's very hard to quantify it like that?
It's hard to qualify because, I mean, the system, it's this integrated system. You know, I don't call it, so now everybody calls it the brain-gut axis. I think that's a really, falls really short of what this really is. It's a system that is bidirectional. It has multiple layers. It has, you know, it includes the gut-associated immune system, the endocrine system, and it's always bidirectional. So what goes on in the gut will be registered in the brain. The brain will respond to it with the autonomic nervous system, and then the gut gets these signals top down and will, if it's, you know, healthy signals or beneficial signals, the brain will try to attenuate these sensations. So it will shut it off. These descending pain inhibitory pathways that go from the brainstem to the spinal cord and can turn off, you know, the sensitivity. So the brain normally, the healthy brain will do that because it realizes it can't really do anything about. But if, as I said earlier, if there's an inflammation or an ulcer or a perforation, then, you know, the brain will kick in. So it's, I would say, I wouldn't call it a brain disease and not a gut disease, but it's really a, you know, this disorder of brain-gut interactions. That's what I would call it.
Yeah, and talking about the bottom up, basically the signal from the gut to the brain, I assume that it's some hormones like now everyone is talking about GLP-1. So that's, I assume, a good example of an hormone that binds to a neuron that basically send a a message to the brain, hey, you are full, don't eat anymore. So those are the most of the signal that getting from the gut to the brain.
Yeah, this is, I mean, there's about 40 of these hormones, GLP-1 obviously got the most attention. But so when I started my career at UCLA, I actually joined the lab of the late John Walsh, who was at the time really the pioneer in this field. And also very interesting, historical, biographical aspect. So there were investigators in Sweden who isolated from tons of pig intestine. They went to the slaughterhouse, get pig intestine, isolated tons of pig intestine, then extracted, identified these hormones. And they sent the extracts to us at UCLA, and we did radioimmunoassays at the time. It was kind of the state of the art. And measured the content of these different hormones. And initially it was like, I think it was about, during my time there, I said about 10 of these, but in the meantime it's 40. And they're stored in specialized called enteroendocrine cells in the gut. And these cells, they function in two ways. They release these hormones in response to stimulus into the bloodstream, so they act like a hormone, but they also release them onto nerve endings, particularly the vagal nerve, sensory nerve endings. And so the signal goes in parallel. One goes to the bloodstream, a slower signal, one goes fast through the vagus nerve. And then these two things are integrated at the brain level again. But yeah, that signaling system plays a big role, in many functions.
And can you provide another example on top of GLP-1 of an hormone that send a signal from the gut to the brain?
Yeah, I mean, there was one that we focused at the time a lot, CCK, cholecystokinin, that was kind of the earliest satiety hormone, not as powerful as GLP-1. There's neurotensin. Yeah, I'm sort of blocking on this long list of substances, but I should mention what happened at the same time. All of a sudden, and I don't know what triggered this. So people identified similar molecular structures to these gut hormones in the brain of animals, and so that was the first time people realized, wow, there's this common biological language that both the gut uses and the brain uses. And then the latest part of that story was that somebody from the NIH at the time sent us these supernatants of cultured cells. Think about that. So these were bacteria. I think it was E. coli, so cell culture, and they contained similar molecular structures as we first seen in the gut and in the brain. So that kind of closed the loop. The main systems within the gut-brain system use the same language to communicate, and receptors to communicate with each other. So that really opened my eyes to it. And I wrote this early review article that my mentor at the time said, yeah, it's great, but it's 10 years too early. You never get this published. But we did get it published. It was actually remarkable. I'm really proud of that paper.
Yeah, so you mentioned the microbiome. And we know that maybe we have more bacteria cells in our body than our cells. And a lot of them are actually located in the gut. So what role they are playing in the communication between the gut and the brain?
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's not really a totally new dimension, because what we found is the communication between the microbes, many of the substances that they produce, and even their components of their cell membrane, particularly of gram-negative bacteria, interact with receptors, these toll-like receptors on nerve endings or in the gut. And so they basically have the ability to connect with that language system by their own, molecules. So just like what we found early on, that this E. coli cell culture produced cholecystokinin. In the meantime, that's known that they produce a lot more neuroactive substances, or for example, this inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA. So there's many molecules that the microbes produce that fit perfectly on the receptors on, for example, these enteroendocrine cells. So they were just a missing piece of the puzzle. They didn't change the original concept. If anything, they confirmed it. But to make it complete, that you don't that one big influence, and obviously quantitatively, it is fairly big because food intake is our biggest interaction with the environment, and so I would say they complete the story. So now I would call this system the brain-gut microbiome system as an integrated. You could call it a supercomputer, or it certainly goes in this direction to understand the complexity and the communication principles that AI is being used increasingly to put these different parts together, because each area has so much information by itself. Just think about the brain, all the stuff that we collect from brain imaging, and all the stuff we collect from the microbiome, the parameters, and the gut complexity. To ultimately understand how these systems interact with each other, I think it's just really, I call it, it's a systems biology challenge. You didn't have it on the notes that you sent me, but this might be a good idea to kind of throw this idea in that, in systems biology, which is something that's growing in popularity in science, the way systems are regulated, it's by multiple influence that each are actually contributing a small amount of the variance. So it's not like what we used to do, we studied pathogens, like dangerous microorganisms, and that one pathogen would act with one poison on one receptor, and that would cause the disease. That's kind of an unusual example. Most of what we see today is really hundreds of thousands of microbes, benign, interact with hundreds of receptors and hundreds of endocrine cells, and then massive numbers of cells in the nervous system. And to understand this, I think you have to fundamentally change the way you analyze and interpret findings. I also think that this is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to show something in humans. So in the mouse, you can isolate one factor of this system biology, and that usually shows you the effect pretty clear cut. Then if you go to humans, you can't isolate it. You deal with this enormity of influences. Each one is small. So we don't know if the microbiome component plays 5% of the variance, for example, in depression, or 30%. Unlikely 30%. It's more like 5% or even less. But this is sort of the big challenge, I would say, right now, to translate, from the animal findings to the humans.
Yeah, and from what I understood from you and from my knowledge, it's basically it's a symbiotic relationship. So the microbiome helping us, but we are also helping them. And it's something that happened not in the last decade, but let's say in a very long time. So the evolution, actually, as you said, some of the receptors are actually binding to some of the molecule that the microbiome created. So it's literally we are in symbiotic relationship with those microbiome, and it's very hard to separate it because it's part of a systematic solution. That's fair to say?
That's fair to say. And this symbiosis, so now we experience a lot of these chronic diseases that we don't really have a good answer for. And so my view, this is, and I share this with some other investigators in the field, like the Sonnenberg lab at Stanford, that a mismatch has developed between these extremely changing environmental and dietary factors, which has happened dramatically over the last 100 years. So this has not happened in evolution before. And so now we have this mismatch of these environmental factors that have influenced the microbes fairly rapidly. But our our bodies, our biology is not used to that. So the symbiosis has sort of been compromised. I think
Yeah.
we're now, yeah.
Yeah.
As a Longevity by Design podcast listener, you understand the value of improving your health for today and for all the years ahead. And if you want to live your healthiest, longest life possible, you need to understand what's going on inside. At Inside Tracker, we take a personalized approach to health span optimization that eliminates guesswork from your wellness plan. Inside Tracker analyzes blood biomarker and DNA data, along with physiomarker data from fitness trackers like Oura Ring, to deliver personalized food, supplement, lifestyle, and exercise recommendations that allow you to take control and improve your health span. And for a limited time, Longevity by Design listeners can get 20% off at the Inside Tracker store. So if you're ready to receive a personal health analysis and data-driven wellness plan to optimize your body for the long haul, then it's time to start inside. Visit insidetracker.com/podcast to get started today. That's insidetracker.com/podcast to get started today.
Again, to explain to the audience, evolution usually each step in the evolution takes like 30 years between you and your actually offspring. And in 100 years is only like 3 generations, and you need maybe hundreds of generations to change it. So we change our diet, significant diet, environment, and so on in the last 100 years, but our body haven't had enough time to adjust for that. And a good example that you mentioned is how ultra-processed food is not good for us and not good for the brain-gut interaction. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, this symbiosis is obviously has evolved and is optimized for the interaction of our gut and, also the gut microbiome with natural foods that humans would encounter. And if you go, I mean, there's a lot of misinformation. People talk about the keto diet, that's the most ancient, type of diet. Just, but when you go back to ancestral populations, doesn't matter if it's in Africa or if it's on the Orinoco River or the Amazon, people have lived pretty well, primarily on, predominantly plant-based foods in roots and tubers and berries and other fruits. And they've, consumed a relatively small amount of animal meat, the meat mainly coming from birds and fish. So I've seen this personally. I've had the privilege and big luck to be on a film expedition to one of these ancestral tribes on the Orinoco River. And so we lived with them in their village for a year. Not for a year, would have been interesting, for a month. And, we were always surprised how much they lived on these plant-based food items, even though they were surrounded by all the animals, so they would not slaughter big animals and divulge on, steak and big meat consumption. The animal protein consumption was many birds that they shot with bow and arrow and fish. So, and you can see this everywhere. I mean, no matter if you go to the Arctic Circle, how the Inuits originally, how they, what diet they had. There's variations on this ancestral diet, but there's some very common principles. And it was generally unprocessed food or mildly processed food. I mean, the main forms of processing that came in history was cooking. This was a huge revolution. And the second one was fermenting. Both of these changed human behavior. So now humans could migrate and carry along their food, didn't go bad. And it also brought them closer together in social communities, because cooking and eating together, changed the social interactions. But in general, these were the main processing. So what has happened now in the last 100 years, obviously an explosion of of chemicals and processes that are applied to our food. Ultimately, I would say the main driving force behind it, not so much preservation, but really to make people hooked on these foods. And the two main ingredients, fat and sugar, and salt, the three that have been added, are probably the main culprits of the negative health effects of ultra-processed foods. You can say, yeah, there's, if you read the fine label, this, on a lot of ultra-processed food products, you see a whole list of chemicals that you've never seen, have no idea what they are. But I think the main three areas that have really caused the negative health effects are these, salt, sugar, and fat.
And okay, so sounds like most of us, I wouldn't say all of us, because some of us are really determined and in all costs avoid the processed food, but it's really hard to do it in our society. So all of us have now a problem because we are consuming those processed food. Do you believe, or have you seen that there is a way to correct it and improve the gut-brain interaction just by changing your diet or maybe lifestyle?
Yeah, I mean, I do believe in this because that's really the main hope that we have. I mean, we can't influence, the speed of genetic adaptations, and that's just we have to accept this as a slow process. And there are examples. I mean, they're not affecting the majority of people in the U.S. Or maybe a little bit more in Europe, or I don't know about. I mean, some of these problems exist everywhere in the Middle East, but I mean, so the changes, clearly diet is one of them, and like you see that people have there's a lot of interest in the Mediterranean diet now, which is sort of the plant-based or predominantly plant-based. There's a growing interest in vegetarian and vegan.
How do emotion like stress, anxiety, or joy actually affect gut function? And also vice versa, how gut function influence your stress, anxiety, or joy?
Yeah, so I mean, the easier and most clear-cut explanation is that we have this system within. So we have the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Central nervous system is under our control. The autonomic nervous system is basically a conduit that transmits what goes on in these brain networks down into the organs. Like, for example, if you take the vagus nerve, I mean, the vagus nerve has contact to pretty most cells in your body, and is a sensory device that reports to the brain whatever goes on, the homeostatic state of your body. And but the vagus nerve also has this branch that talks back to the cells, and it can do all these kind of things like stimulate acid secretion when you have eaten something wrong to improve digestion. It can also change the motor contractions, how fast things move through your gut. And these physiological systems can also be engaged when you're stressed, for example. So during anger, you send down very strong vagal signals and sympathetic nervous. So there's two components: the sympathetic nervous system and the vagus, kind of on opposite ends. And so these systems basically assure that there's always a coordination between what the brain perceives, stress, relaxation, pleasure, hunger, and it will communicate this to your body and to your gut. Very elaborate systems that involves both the nervous system and the hormonal system. So hormones are being secreted. In the most severe state of stress, you also engage another system, which is called the hypothalamic pituitary axis, HPA axis, which stimulates cortisol, another stress mediator, that normally doesn't kick in until the stress becomes severe. So you have things for day-to-day stress and emotions, but then when it gets really dangerous, the cortisol kicks in. So this is all these top-down communications. And from the from the gut up, the signals have basically several avenues to reach the brain. One is through these neuroactive substances that we talked about that microbes produce, and they act on these endocrine cells in the gut, and then the gut sends, these hormones in the blood and through the vagus nerve. When the microbes come in contact with the gut wall, which basically where the gut-based immune system lies, when they come in contact with any sensors of the immune system, that triggers another signaling pathway mediated by things like cytokines and inflammatory mediators and lipopolysaccharides. So there's a number of these substances, very powerful, and they affect both things in the periphery, the nerve endings again, the vagus nerve, but also they travel through the blood, cross the blood-brain barrier, and influence the immune cells at the brain level. So that's the second one. And so we have the neural, vagus nerve primarily, the hormonal, and the immune pathways. And they're not independent from each other. They influence each other. So that's why I talk about a system. You don't just have an axis that goes from one point to another.
So question about that. We discussed how important is the microbiome. So what happens when we are taking antibiotics and most likely the majority of the bacteria will disappear? Do we see alteration in the gut-brain interaction, or it stay the same?
Yeah, this has something to do with this concept of resilience. So any system, so one of the big advantages of any system is resilience, meaning in response to a perturbation or a stressor or an insult, it will not just break down, but it will rebound typically, to the same level as before. The more complex the system is, the better the resilience is, the more diverse the system is. And so an antibiotic is a pretty massive insult, more massive than food and so there have been studies that in healthy people, you take an antibiotic and you decrease the diversity and the richness of the microbiome. After one dose, it comes back in the majority of people to the same level as was before. If you do it 3 times, not everybody will fully recover. If you do it, and we don't know this and we know this more from animal models, if you do this at a critical time of the development of the microbiome, the first 1,000 days of life, as we always say, from conception really to, then it's much more difficult to come back, because that early insult, while the microbiome system is built up, any insult is likely to cause lasting damage and compromise. So that's why people that have these adverse early life experiences, either in terms of exposure to chemicals or diet, or exposure to stressful events that the brain sends down to the microbiome, that these individuals actually quite common. It's like in my practice, I would say between 20 and 40% of patients give a history like that something was not perfect in the first 1,000 days of life, that this will. So if somebody who had that early insult to the microbiome and then later takes an antibiotic, their ability to bounce back is much lower. This is something that we're seeing, today's total overuse of, a non-medically indicated overuse of antibiotics, particularly early on in life. So pediatricians, upon the urging of concerned mothers when their child has a bad cold, they want an antibiotic because they don't want to see their child suffering. But 90% of these colds or upper respiratory tract infections are caused by viruses, which will not respond to the antibiotics.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is try not to treat a human below the age of 3 years old with antibiotics, because that can have an effect later in life. So try to allow them to develop the right microbiome flora and don't interrupt it. Obviously, if it's a life and death, you don't have a choice, but try not to do it. A follow-up question, what about the aging process? So Do you see a stronger effect of antibiotic or stronger negative effect on antibiotic if you are giving it to 80 years old person versus a 50 or 20 years old a person? Or they respond the same based on what happened in the early years?
Well, I mean, so it's in general, the whole system, this brain gut microbiome system, becomes more prone to, to major insults causing damage. That's just a property. If you age healthy, and there's a lot of, as you know, there's a lot of effort now of healthy longevity. So we don't have to get a weakening of the system just because of the age, because we're 70 or 80. There's individuals nowadays that live into their 90s. And, just a recent case that was analyzed in great detail with all the aspects, microbiome, brain, it was shown that, the microbiome was actually quite normal, but then there were earlier studies where they studied elderly people in nursing homes. And obviously that came out, they had a really compromised microbiome. We know today that most of this compromise came from the lifestyle and the diet in these nursing homes. If you maintain your healthy, largely plant-based diet and are physically active and don't take 5 regular medications that a lot of people nowadays take when they get older, then your system will not be damaged. If you're exposed to a severe condition like COVID, the elderly were obviously more vulnerable. But again, I think that's because these elderly that got COVID to a greater degree were the ones that also had the poor lifestyle, the poor diet, and not necessarily because they were older. So the question about age, I think healthy longevity is a hot topic right now. And I tend to believe that age by itself is not a major factor that compromises your microbiome. I think it's the way we have created, the world of aging, life of aging people is the main reason.
Yeah, so it sounds like for the microbiome diversity and health, it's mainly environment and nutrition, and it's not other factor, which is good. That means that we have a control of that, and we can manage it if we'll behave in a good way. And I want to follow up related to this field. So it sounds like we learned a lot, let's say, in the last 4 decades that you studied it from something that everyone said, why the hell are you looking at the interaction between gut brain, to something that everyone is looking at and talking about it, and which is a great achievement for you. My question is, where do you see the field of gut-brain science heading over the next decade or so?
Yeah, it's always difficult to predict, particularly in a world where AI is rapidly rising. It seems like almost everything is becoming unpredictable because there were going to be such dramatic changes in our understanding. And I think what's likely is that these negative environmental conditions, including food, will continue. They're not going to disappear. So we're not going to go back to our ancestors' lifestyle. We're also not changing, genetically. So I think the challenge will remain. From what I've seen, there's going to be a paper that's coming out in this prestigious journal of Neuron. I just heard about this yesterday. That is very critical of the brain-gut axis. I haven't seen this paper. I wish I could have read it before we talk. And, I think what I suspect is people will say, well, there haven't been any therapeutic breakthroughs. There's the microbiome science keeps adding new aspects and new animal findings to it, but it hasn't really changed. There's no phenomenal microbiome targeted therapy that prevents Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's. And coming back to my earlier argument, yes, what we've seen in animal models is tempting to make these speculations that it will be very successful at some point. But there are these ideas, these systems biological ideas. What if the microbiome in humans just plays 5% of the influence, and all these other factors that we have studied before, are equally important. But there's one thing that I've been involved in as a consultant to a startup company that has created a bioengineered probiotic. So the idea is that microbes are perfect vehicles to carry a target or a cargo to a particular target. So you can determine the cargo, so what's in the microbiome or in this microbe, but you can also program it to where it goes. Does it go a small intestine or large intestine? What cell type? So it's something that nature has come up with, a system that we can take advantage of potentially. And give you just one example that I've been involved in, so I can say I've seen the data. And so normally probiotics stay away from inflamed tissue. Pathogens like Staphylococcus, they would home into an inflamed area and attack it and thrive in this inflammation. Probiotics they don't like it. They don't colonize, they don't stay there. So just by changing part of the genome, very subtle change, you can reprogram them that they actually now home into the inflammation, the beneficial microbes. And this approach has been tested in mouse models and pig models and is just now going into first phase clinical trials. And that has pretty remarkable effects, like not subtle, but really remarkable. And there's also scientists that are using this technique, for example, to create probiotics that break down microplastics. So you would take your probiotic. Obviously, we are inundated with microplastics and nanoplastics. That is also something that will not disappear. If anything, seems to be getting worse. But if we had microbes that we take our pill, every morning and make sure that this plastic will basically be excreted, it will not stay in our system, could have phenomenal impact potentially. I mean, we don't know what the microplastic does yet, but I would imagine that. And so there's many examples. Same thing could apply to Parkinson's and to Alzheimer's disease. So I think the biggest promise in the microbiome field in terms of applications to human treatments is this bioengineering of microbes, with the dangers that that we don't know about. I mean, the long-term dangers. Anytime you influence or manipulate an ancient ecosystem, the good story about the rabbits in Australia, they thought they were doing a good thing introducing rabbits in Australia, and they become, an ecological nightmare. So the same thing could happen with these engineered microbes, but I tend to be more on the positive side. I think this is the one thing that I feel could revolutionize certainly psychiatry, because we haven't really gotten that further in psychiatry with having treatments that are different from the ones we used 40 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I haven't heard about it. So basically, directed the microbiome to the right place, to the infection area or to the brain if you have some dementia-related syndrome. That's very interesting, and thank you for talking about that. I have many more questions, but we are starting to run out of time. So I would like to go into a rapid fire round and ask you a few questions. A quick question, and I would love to hear a quick answer for them. And so the first one is one daily habit that supports your gut-brain health. What would you recommend our user to do?
If you ask me for one, I would probably say it's regular exercise. But very close to that would be a dietary recommendation. A particular group of plant-based foods like the legumes that are powerhouses of protein, fiber, and polyphenols. So it's almost like a supplement, for the healthiest foods that we have. So
Okay,
if you,
good.
yeah.
Good. So you're saying exercise and legume. Thank you. Your favorite food for longevity?
Yeah, so that would be, so I should have waited for the second question. So definitely the legumes are the ones that fulfill the criteria of the things that a lot of people are missing today. Yeah, I would stick with that, and this is basically lentils, beans, peas that are powerhouses of healthy longevity prolonging foods.
Excellent. And any book or idea that influence your understanding of mind and body health that you can recommend to our listener?
Yes, I mean, one of the first books that really influenced me a lot was this this book, The Healing Brain. It's website. Yeah, that during my medical school time was really had a major influence on me. And then, there's a series of authors that I've been following. One about Craig, an interoception expert. So he wrote this book, How Do You Feel? And there's a lot about the system of interoception that carries information from our bodies to the brain. And then there's also the series of books from Antonio Damasio about, consciousness and the role of emotions play in human consciousness. So I would say I've sort of stuck with books that have resonated with me from the beginning of my career.
Okay. And the one myth about gut health or aging you would like to debunk?
Well, it's the whole concept of biohacking, like what people call biohacking, that you would basically be smarter than billions of years of evolution and come up with some compound, doing something with your coffee, putting, fat in your coffee, and you would have this influence. So I would say the concept of biohacking and believing that there's these simplistic interventions that are usually connected to selling something, not healthy food, but selling a supplement or selling some product. I think that's the biggest myth. Yeah, I would say I try to practice the things that I'm been writing in my books, and that's a combination of regular physical exercise, contemplative practices, not long-term, meditation, but meditative practices, several times a day. The healthy diet, clearly, and yeah, I would say with these three, and then social interactions with other people. I would say that with these four things, I feel pretty confident that I'm doing the most that I can do. I don't take supplements because I think, with these general guidelines, you do the most that you can do based on our current knowledge.
So, Dr. Mayer, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your incredible insight on how our gut, brain, and emotion are intertwined in the pursuit of longer and healthier life. That was fascinating. And for our listener who want to learn more, visit emeranmayer.com and explore his best-selling books, The Mind-Gut Connection and The Gut Immunity Connection. So again, thank you so much. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed today's episode of Longevity by Design, please like and follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Leave us the rating and review. It helps more people discover this conversation about science, health, and longevity. And thanks again for tuning to Longevity by Design, produced by InstaTracker. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much, Dr. Mayer. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Gil. Pleasure was all on my side. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for listening to Longevity by Design. Please subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Longevity by Design is powered by InsideTracker, a personalized health optimization platform that helps people improve their lives by improving their bodies from the inside out using personalized, science-backed recommendations for nutrition, supplements, and lifestyle changes. To learn more, visit InsideTracker.com/podcast.